Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Real Talk. It's Lucas here, and I hope that today's episode informs and inspires you to have your own real conversations. As always, today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Trivan, maker of trucks, trailers, and enclosure buildings tailored to your needs. Be sure to check them out at trivan.com. A huge thanks to them for sponsoring the show and making it possible. One other quick note before we get into today's episode is that if you are willing and able, if you could leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on any of the podcast networks or platforms that allow for it, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts, that will be much appreciated as it helps get the word out there and lets people know what we're all about. So, with that in mind, on to the episode. Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Real Talk. Today, it's myself as the host, Lucas Holfleur, and we have another interesting podcast to bring for you. So our guest today is Mr. Al Siebring. Some of you may recognize that name. He's a very fascinating man, has a long career in journalism and radio. He also spent time working at ARPA, in Lighthouse News, as many of you might know him from his time there. And then he was also a councillor and mayor of North Cowichan. I got to get the pronunciation right. So
yeah, get that
there
right.
We go. All right, perfect. So how you doing, Al? Thanks for joining.
I'm good. And we should add, today I'm an Albertan. I moved to Alberta about a year ago to be closer to the 11 grandkids. So I'm no longer out in the West Coast.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, okay, so I think as far as our chat goes today, we want to just talk about kind of your life and your career and the lessons learned. You've had a very interesting career and a lot of time in public life as a Reformed Christian. So I think there's plenty to learn from you in that regard. But perhaps maybe we'll start at the beginning because that's always a great place to start, I think. You want to tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what kind of got you interested in journalism and politics at large?
I was born in Brazil, and as I like to say, that's where the nuts come from. But my parents emigrated there after the war, part of a Canadian Reformed church colony down there, and they were there for about 15 years. And my elder siblings were quite a bit older than I was. My sister was 17, 18, getting to be married age, and my dad looked around, and everybody was getting to be everybody's cousin, and he went, "That's it, we're out of here." And he had two brothers on the west coast of Canada, so we re-emigrated in 1963 to Vancouver Island. Dad had two brothers there, and Dad started up another dairy farm and worked there until he retired in the early 70s. So where I grew up, primarily I'd say the west coast, because I was like 5 when we moved to the island. I don't remember much about Brazil, and that was kind of my growing up years were on a dairy farm out on Vancouver Island. As far as getting interested in journalism, I went to public high school. We didn't have a Christian high school on the island at that time. And in junior high, I was involved in the drama club. You get involved in extracurriculars. And we were putting on some production. And there was a local cable TV channel that would go out and do community stuff. And the cable TV channel was run out of the senior high school. And they actually had a credit course of what they called graphic communications, which was TV production. And the TV crew showed up at our drama production one night, and they wanted a video thing, and they realized they were short a crew member. So they kind of put the call out to the kids in the junior high, anybody available to help. And I was not on stage doing anything in that production. I was backstage, and the stuff that I had to do had been done. So I put my hand up. I went, "Yeah, sure, put me on a TV camera. That'll be fun." And I was 14. I did that for 15 minutes. I knew this is what I wanted to do, was something to do with the electronic mass communication. And so from there, when I got to the public high school, I took the graphic communications courses, grade 11 and 12. Both in my grade 11 year, we were in a semester program. By the time I was in grade 12, I was working in the TV studio there, because that TV studio also produced all the local content. And I was under one of Pierre Trudeau's old LIP grants, local initiative program. It was a job creation thing for students. Loved it. was having so much fun and spending so much time there that at one point the guidance counselor came to me and said, Al, the rest of your studies in the high school are suffering. Remember, I'm in grade 12. You got to drop this TV stuff so you can. I went, no, it's the only place in here I'm learning anything. And I walked away. Never got my grade 12 at that point. A few years later, I end up in Edmonton. And I ran into a guy named Bob Layton. If you're from the West, if you're from Alberta, you'll have heard the name. Bob was a very prominent broadcaster in Edmonton, and he ran a broadcast school. And I was looking to get into radio, and there was a job in Saskatchewan somewhere, and I needed an audition tape. In those days, you sent out cassette tapes. That was the audition process. So I knew the guy that ran the school for Bob, and I said, Arnie, I need to rent some studio time because I got to cut a tape. Oh, okay, fine. It was $50 an hour or whatever it was. And so I rented the studio and I did the tape, and Arnie wanted to listen to it. So he listened to it. It's not bad, but you need our course. He's trying to sell me on this broadcast course. And I said, Arnie, I don't have the 2 years you want to take out of my life, and B, I don't have the $1,500 you want to take out of my pocket. So sorry, but no. And he's, pushing. Finally, he looked at me. Okay, you're such a smart aleck. He says, you think you know everything anyway. He said, review our course material for 6 weeks. And it was all written, and there were some audio lectures on cassettes. Review our course material for 6 weeks. Write the final. If you pass, give me $100 and we'll give you the diploma. If you flunk, give me the other $1,400 and stay for the other 18 months or whatever it was. I went, okay. I got the highest grade they ever handed out. And it was a federally accredited course. So I got 4 high school credits. I got my grade 12.
Hey, there you go.
So it was kind of fun. That was my introduction. And by the time I'd done all that, the job in Saskatchewan was filled. So I wound up, my first radio job was in Creston, BC. We used to say it was a 250 watt radio station, a 300 watt light bulb would put you off the air. But it was in a little valley between a bunch of mountains, and we could have gone 50,000 watts, wouldn't have made any difference. So went from there and did a lot of kicking around in various markets. We can talk about that. As far as my interest in politics, I didn't really get interested till my probably early 20s. Interestingly, Grant Motley, who's the father of the current NDP leader here in Alberta, Rachel Motley. Grant was a friend of mine. I was working at the Alberta legislature as a reporter at that time. And I came very close to running, believe it or not, for the NDP in an election in, I think in 1980 or 81. Grant had me convinced. And I mean, it's kind of testimony to the old adage. I'm not sure if it was Shakespeare or Churchill or somebody came up with this. It said, show me a man in his 20s who's not a socialist, and I'll show you a man with no heart. Show me the same man in his 40s with 3 kids and a mortgage who's still a socialist, and I'll show you a man with no brains.
Yeah. Very true.
So I'm kind of living testimony to that, because over the years, I've really kind of swung the other way. And to be fair, I mean, I think if Grant Motley could see what the Alberta NDP had become, he'd be rolling over in his grave. I don't know. I mean, he died in a plane crash the day my youngest daughter was born. That was, I tell you, a day of pretty mixed emotions for me. I tore up any membership cards and I stayed away from any partisan political involvement for about 10 years after that. It just soured me on the whole process. But yeah, it is what it is.
Well, okay. So that's quite the story. I like that a lot. What, before we get down the road a bit, like what drew you to radio? What was so special about it that you felt, I need to be here? This is kind of my calling.
I did some television in front of the camera.
Yep.
And I did radio, which is a different thing. When you do television and you walk into the grocery store to buy a jug of milk and you got something wrong the night before, I was doing weather of all things. I was a weather guy on a TV station for a while. And you get it wrong, and people are in your face, and you're recognizable, right? I mean, they see you. It's the same face they see on TV. Radio has a certain anonymity to it that I liked. You weren't, I mean, yes, people recognize the voice a little bit, but it's a different feel. And the other thing, just from a pure journalism perspective, we always used to refer to television as the 10-ton pencil. I mean, radio story breaks, I make a phone call, I can have the thing on the air within 15, 20 minutes if it's urgent enough. Television, you got to have B-roll and you got to have video and you got to haul all the equipment out there and do all this and that. I mean, you don't have to, you can do it the other way. And if you do it the other way, it's basically radio with pictures. But good television requires a lot more work and back, I want to say backstory, but stuff that people aren't aware of, but that has to be done to make for good television. Radio is a lot simpler to produce and a lot more immediate. So that was the thing.
Very nice. Okay, so you're in Creston. You're at that radio station.
Yep.
Are you married yet at this point? Do you have a family? And you bounced around a bit. Take us through that time in your life.
Oh no, I didn't get married till quite a bit later.
Okay.
I'll just run you through the list because it's long. Okay. Creston, Nelson, Yorkton, Saskatchewan, Westlock, Alberta, then Edmonton, then back to Westlock for a while, then back to Edmonton for a while, then Victoria, Calgary, Regina, Lethbridge, and then Sioux Center, Iowa. I ran the radio station for Dordt College, the old KDCR, which just sadly went off the air last year. I was there for a temporary appointment. The people who were in charge were off to get their doctors and masters and whatever. So they hired me to sort of fill in for a few years. And then when I came back to Canada, I spent some time outside the radio business and then wound up back at my hometown on the West Coast in the Cowichan Valley and worked at my hometown radio station there. It was kind of funny. I've gone back there to do something else in retail. And the owner of the station literally ran into me on the street one day. We were still fixturing the store. And, Al, what are you doing in town? I said, well, I'm opening up this store. I said, I was thinking, this was May of 2000. I said, maybe in September I'll come see you and we can have some fun with radio or get back into doing some morning stuff. September, can you start Monday? It was kind of one of those things. So I did both. I did both for a while. And then I kind of backed out of that, mostly because I had done it for, at that point, about 30 years. And most of the time was spent doing mornings. And mornings is up at 3:15 a.m. because that 6 o'clock newscast doesn't just happen, right? I mean, all that stuff's got to be, especially in the early days when we were ripping the teletype. I mean, now it's all computer-based, but back then we had reams of paper to go through every morning, and you had to throw out the forecast for Newfoundland and, the stuff that didn't matter, but it all rolled, so you had to work through it all. And but after 30 years of getting up that early, I just went, no, I'm done. And then I did some podcasting with a few different organizations, but nobody really figured out how to monetize that yet. Then I got back into commercial radio, the same company that ran the hometown station. They bought a whole bunch of other ones, and I was doing morning newscasts, but prepared usually late the night before. So I wasn't getting up super early. I was going to bed super late. But I was doing, you're driving your truck around in Grand Prairie, Alberta, or in Cold Lake, or in a couple of markets in BC. And there's Al in the morning news talking about what the local town council did last night. People had no idea. I was sitting in my basement in my jammies in Maple Bay. I mean, that's the nature of radio today. You have no idea where those voices are actually coming from. So I did that for about 4 years. And during that time, I got into municipal politics. And during that time, I started as a contractor with ARPA doing the Lighthouse news thing. And then when I became mayor, I didn't have time for any of that other stuff. And I just focused exclusively on being mayor till last October when I said, that's it, we're done. I'm 65, I'm retired. So there you go.
Okay. There's the executive summary. All right. Man, a lot of places to jump in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, you stuck around in the radio sphere, and that kind of spoke to you. Do you ever get into any sort of print journalism at all, or you just kind of stuck with radio?
I did a little bit of television when I was working in Calgary. I was at CFCN, and I was doing some weekend stuff, and they needed work. They needed help on the TV side. I did some print. I did a fair bit of commentary in print, just columns. When I was in a new community, I'd go see the newspaper, and they're always looking for half-decent writers, and I'm a pretty half-decent writer, so I would do some of the local columns in the weeklies. Through a lot of those years, I was also I did a weekly or a monthly, I guess, column for Christian Renewal in the United Reformed side. I quit that 2001. I didn't quit. I got divorced, and I just looked at that situation and went, I don't have a lot of credibility right now until this blows over. So I backed away from it. And I still occasionally contribute to CR, but only when John Van Dyke's desperate for something that he doesn't think anybody else wants to take on. I did a piece on COVID last year that he'd been looking and looking, and I tried to provide a little balance on that one. But I don't do a lot of that anymore. That was, the print thing it was as much as anything when I was doing the radio, it was a case of trying to get some name recognition for the radio personality that I would, I'd always tie the weekly newspaper column to the fact that, hey, he's the local morning radio guy, so that people would start to make some connections.
Smart. Yep. No, I like that. Is that kind of job, like, I'm just thinking for any of our younger listeners who are listening to your career and think, oh, that's kind of a neat job. I hadn't really thought about that. It does seem like it requires a lot of moving around and whatnot. Was that challenging for family life when you're in the radio business?
It was. We quit moving. Well, the kids were, I guess the oldest was about 14 when we did our final move to the coast. But I don't recommend a career like I had, and not so much because of the moving, but because of the nature of what journalism has become. It's such a corporate mess now. There's very little sort of independent, unbiased, objective journalism. Everybody's got spin. Everybody's got an agenda. Quite often, it's set in the corporate offices. I mean, I'll tell you a funny story from one of the radio stations I worked at. Which one doesn't really matter. But I was doing morning news, and this was in the day when radio news still mattered, and we had a 15-minute package at 8 o'clock in the morning. And so it was lead off with 4 minutes of news, then a break for weather and this and that, and then 2 more minutes of news, just sort of the wrap up stuff, and then some sports and whatever. But the whole package is 15 minutes. Today it's 3 minutes at the top of the hour. Canada's burning, the Russians have bombed Detroit, now more music. I mean, right? That's kind of the way they do it now. But back then we took it a little more seriously. And I was putting together this 8 o'clock package. I remember it was a Wednesday morning, and my phone rings in the newsroom. It's about 3 minutes to 8. I pick it up, and it's the manager of the local McDonald's restaurant. And he says, I hear that there's a story moved on the wires this morning about a woman in Chicago who ate a Big Mac and keeled over and died. Apparently 1 person in 3 million is allergic to the secret sauce, and she was the one. And so I walk over to the teletype, and sure enough, it's just coming across. The guy goes, you run that story, we're pulling our advertising. I said, oh, thank you very much. And I hung up the phone. Normally, I probably would have ignored it. If I hadn't ignored it, I might have used it as what we call the kicker, the funny little thing at the end, right? The human interest story.
Yeah.
I led the second half of the newscast with it just because he took me off. That was it. That was at 8:09.
Yeah.
By 8:15, the general manager had summoned me into the office. By 8:30, the rest of the newsroom joined me, and by 9 o'clock, we'd all quit.
Oh, wow.
Just on principle, to say, you know what, sorry, but you don't, no, that's not how this works.
So how did that go down? Did y'all get rehired or what?
No, we were done. It was a Wednesday, and we were all done on Friday. We walked. What was interesting was on that Friday, the GM popped his head in the door. I'm finishing my day at my last newscast was at 11 or something.
Yeah.
And just before go on, he goes, Al, I got your severance check here, but I'm not giving it to you until we go for lunch. I said, okay, that's fair. So I finished my day. I packed my stuff. I head out. We go for lunch at the local hotel. And he says, Al, he says, I understand where you're coming from and the editorial integrity and stuff like that. But if you're ever going to pull a stunt like this again, sleep on it for 24 hours. And if you ever need a reference, call me. And he was always good for that. So, I mean, it was an interesting lesson but I guess what I'm saying is those kinds of sort of hard and fast principled stands against editorial independence. You don't see them anymore.
No.
And because it's just the culture, the news media culture has become so I don't know what the word I'm looking for here is, but it's dictated by the suits more than the journalists. I mean, we used to have a slogan in one of the radio stations I worked at. It was up on the wall, and it said, "News is something that somebody somewhere is trying to hide. All the rest is advertising." I mean, that's a bit of a hard-nosed attitude, but it's not a bad way to approach it. And today, that approach is just no longer there. It's just it's been co-opted by the corporate stuff and by the government funding. It drives me a little nuts. So, sorry, that was a little rant, but
no, that's good. It's nice to hear, or it's not nice to hear, but it's helpful to hear at least a perspective of someone who's been in the industry, seen the change happen. Because coming from my vantage point as a younger person, I did a little bit of time in journalism myself before I got into business and whatnot. I was kind of active with Post Millennial and getting them off the ground and with those guys. And now I think they sold off to some US firm or whatever in Tennessee. But anyways, that's besides the point. But yeah, a lot of journalism today is, I do agree, it's all slanted. But I guess what I kind of thought when I was in that game a little bit is everybody has their slant. It's just a matter of which slant you bring to the table. I see your point about I see your point about editorial integrity, and that is something we could definitely do a better job of today. But I wonder, was the bias more well hidden in past years, and now it's just like it's very much the culture war has grown and the rift is very much obvious, and now we just see it more for what it is, or is it more just moral decay? People have less integrity than they used to, sort of thing.
Well, in the first place, and some of my old school fellow journalists don't like it when I say this, but there is no such thing as objectivity in journalism, true objectivity. Everybody, I mean, worldviews are like belly buttons, okay? Everybody brings something to the table, and that something, the way they view the world, colors the kind of questions they ask, colors the way the kind of language they use when they write a story. Are you pro-life or are you anti-abortion? What term do you use in a newscast? So those kinds of things, of course, color it. But equally, there was, I think, more of an attempt. I sound like an old guy here, but I think there was more of an attempt in those days to at least get both sides of a story rather than just focus on one. And that's different today. I don't see that even an attempt at balance. It's just not there.
Do you think that's an ideological shift in the population? Like, I would say, if I were to guess, I would say something along the lines of, perhaps if we view everything as power, and that the message is power and speech is power and whatnot, and people just think like, look, we just need to get our message out there, and it's not a matter of trying to be objective. It's a matter of winning the war of words. Like, does that hold any worth?
Yeah, there's some of that. There's several factors. Part of it, newsrooms today are so under-resourced that you're happy to get even one half of the story on the air because at least you got something on the air. That's number one. Yeah. And the other piece to this is there are certain things that in polite society we just don't even talk about anymore. I mean, for the occupants of probably 99.9% of the country's newsrooms, just as an example, the abortion matter is settled. Opening that can of worms with any kind of discussion, and I went through the Morgentaler years, and I got some stories there too. But that asking whether abortion is appropriate is like asking whether it's appropriate to beat your wife in most newsrooms today. So it doesn't even come up, right? Because that's just the paradigm. And yeah, that's part of it. That's reality, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, there's just a lot less debate too. I think that's a big part of it, right? People just aren't, like you say, they're not interested in hearing the other side. So yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of cultural factors at play there below the surface. But okay, anyways, let's move on a little bit. So you're in radio, you're moving around, then you settle down on the West Coast there. I see here we got in our notes about you were a nominee for the Missioner Award for investigative journalism. So you're not just
it's Canada's Pulitzer, actually. Not many people know about it, but it's a biggie.
Okay, very cool. So you're not just, given the weather and whatnot, you're actually doing some real investigative journalism. So what happened there? This was in the Edmonton area, I'm guessing?
Yeah, it was in Edmonton. I went through, because I knew you were going to ask this. I went through some notes again. I'm not overstating this, I don't think, but the mayor of Edmonton at that time, late 70s, early 80s, got involved in some controversy over some land acquisitions in an area just outside the city that was going to be annexed to the city. And of course, if land gets annexed to a city, it goes up in value. And so we caught him out on that. And it was myself and a guy from CBC. We were co-nominated, a fellow named James Wark, because it turns out we were at the land titles office doing research, and we both realized we were after the same thing. So we went, we could compete, but let's just pool our resources, which our editors weren't happy, but it's what we did. And we came up with the story. And at the end of the day, the incumbent mayor at that time lost by, I'm pretty sure it was the largest margin of any mayor in Edmonton history. His opponent beat him 2-1 in voting, and Edmonton's a big city, so it was a pretty substantial defeat for that individual.
Okay, very nice. So what goes into something like that? Like, it's just months of research. Like, this is the 80s too, so you're dusting off the books and you're looking at the records. You can't just do a quick search online.
It's not like you can bring up Alberta registries on your laptop and let her rip. We actually had to dig into records. There were corporate records, and there were land titles records, and the one thing we never could get our hands on were bank records, because part of the backstory, there was a big development that was happening in Edmonton at that time. And if I say which one it is, you'll know what it is. But even now, 40 years later, there's liability issues, so I'm not going there. But it was a big development that to this day has never been zoned for what it became. But we know, and we could never prove, that there were some financial transactions going on that were heading into one branch of a bank and then being withdrawn in another branch of the bank. This was in the early days where you could do that stuff. And so, it was a mess. It was a real mess. And but he's no longer the mayor. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Perhaps this was a certain shopping center, maybe, but we'll leave it at that, perhaps.
I didn't say that.
No. Okay, fair enough. All right. Well, yeah, you had a long career in radio and broadcasting. Going back to kind of the worldview discussion we were having. So you're doing all this as a Reformed Christian in a space where I can't imagine there were too many Reformed Christians. Maybe some Christians for sure, but tell me a bit about what that was like and how that evolved over the years too, because I'm sure it got more and more challenging as the years went on.
I've never, and I may be criticized for this, but I've never worn my faith on my sleeve in the sense that, it identifies me publicly. But at the same time, I've always done what I do in a way that's colored by the worldview I hold. And people do notice that. And some of that, it comes back to what we were saying earlier about the choice of questions you ask, or the choice of language you use when you're writing a story, right?
Yep.
And I mean, I had, I mentioned Morgentaler. I actually had lunch with Morgentaler at the same table many years ago before he went to jail. It was some event in Edmonton, I don't know, and I ended up, it was a Chamber of Commerce or something, and he was the guest speaker. I don't know how I ended up at his table, but I did. So I engaged him, but I engaged him on stuff that he was not used to being engaged on, like the life of the unborn child. He didn't want to talk about that. But so you put those kinds of I don't want to say arguments, but the way you present issues, even in discussion with coworkers, or in this case with him, shows folks that you come at this from a different perspective. And I remember one job I had, and it was the one in Victoria. I had a boss there who was quite a character, typical West Coast leftover hippie, dope smoking type. But when I left, he pulled me aside and he goes, "Al, there's something I don't get about the way you do the work." I said, "What?" He says, "Your motivation is different than anybody else." He said, what drives you?" I said, "Well, I have a different perspective on life than you. And, we talked about that. And so, I mean, he had noticed that there was something off if you look at it from a worldly perspective. Same thing actually when I was mayor just last year. When I decided to retire, the staff had a little retirement going away thing for me one afternoon. And the city manager, and that relationship is always interesting between a mayor and what they call chief administrative officer, which is a CAO. You work closely together, and sometimes you can't help but becoming, I don't know about friends, but you can't really become friends because he's still your employee. So you need to be careful with that. But, you develop a relationship. And at that farewell thing, the CAO got up to sort of introduce me to say my goodbyes. And the very first thing that came out of his mouth when he was describing Al Siebring, the mayor, was a man of faith. And I kind of looked at him and go, where did you even get that? Because, like I said, I don't wear it on my sleeve, right? But, so, there are just the way you approach and the way you view the world. I remember in the middle of COVID, there was the Victoria Times columnists had this thing where they were helping out local charities. Everybody was locked down, and the kids' charities and all these things needed money for different food programs because the school lunches were canceled. So they were doling, and it was a lot of money. They were doling out millions through their foundation, and so they asked me to write a piece for the Cowichan Valley in terms of where this money could be used, and to ask people to donate. And I started it off with the quote from Dickens, the best of times, the worst of times. And then I right away juxtaposed that with Proverbs, it's better to give than to receive. And when you're the mayor, everything goes through staff. You don't, I mean, you have original thoughts, but everything gets screened. So I'd written this op-ed and I sent it to the city manager, who sent it to the comms people, and they bounced it back. And city manager says, I already know what you're going to say, but you really should take out that reference to Proverbs. It doesn't belong there. I said, no, it's Stan. And the publisher at the Times columnist got back to me later and he went, it's one of the best pieces I've ever read. And thank you for leaving that Solomon thing in. People need that historical context. So, right, I mean, it just is what it is. But there are different perspectives. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, definitely. Just living in a Christian way. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be preaching from your radio chair or whatnot, right? It's over a long career and impacting a lot of people. I'm sure they could see the quiet faith that you have, and that's I think for a lot of people that's honestly the preferred way, or going to be the natural way. Like I relate to that a lot myself. I'm not I'm not out there trying to be actively converting people, and perhaps maybe I should be in some regard, but you try to just live your life, especially, for myself in like a business, like we're in the construction industry. So it's, it can come up, but it's not something that often comes up, So, anywho, okay. So you were talking about Morgentaler there, and obviously that was a big debate, going on throughout kind of your time in radio and whatnot. Was this debate a lot more alive back then? Like, did you ever do any sort of call-in radio, like where you had people call in and do debate style stuff on this?
I did a little bit of talk radio in Regina, but that never came up. But interestingly, and you bring this up, I'm gonna segue to something here about media bias that
Sure.
will, I think, illustrate some stuff. When I was working in Regina, and the Morgentaler issue was pretty front and center at that time. The courts were issuing different rulings, so we would get the local pro-choice group, whoever that was, and this is Regina, the birthplace of the NDP. So you've got some pro-choice groups to talk to, and we would always try to reach out to the Saskatchewan pro-life contingent, which at that time was headed up by some roofer who did it out of his basement, and he was working and. Quite often it would take him, 4 days, 5 days a week, 10 days to get back to us to return a phone call. On radio, that's ancient history. I mean, I'm sorry, but we're just not interested anymore. We need it now. So the newsroom that I was working at and that I was sort of co-managing in Regina was consistently being accused by the pro-lifers of being pro-abortion. That was just the reality. Fast forward a couple of years, I'm in Lethbridge, Alberta. And I mean, Lethbridge, right? Heart of the Bible Belt, bunch of Mormons. The pro-choicers can hold their convention in the phone booth down the street. They don't exist. And Morgentaler was still brewing at that time. So whenever a new ruling came out, we would call both sides. Guess who got back to us? The pro-life folks. And the pro-choice people would take a week to 10 days. And that newsroom got accused of being way too pro-life.
Yeah.
Sometimes the reality is the sociological reality of the community you're living in. So it's not always that the media is against you. Sometimes, at least back then, we tried to provide the balance. But if you don't have the organizational capacity as a pro-life group, for example, to do that, then don't advertise yourself, because you're hurting your own credibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that does make sense. And I think you do see that in different news organizations too, even today still, where if they're more like, I mean, the CBC is certainly biased, but I'm sure they have less right-wing and less pro-life contacts to go to for a news story than they would on the other side of the fence. So it's just a bit of a numbers game too, right? So that's a good point. That makes sense. Nice to get the inside scoop on kind of, how the sausage is made in terms of getting commentary on a media story.
That's it. Yeah.
Any other stories you want to get to from your journalistic career? Or otherwise, we can move into some of the ARPA stuff if you want.
My favorite story from my days in journalism, it involves Charles and Diana, soon to be King Charles, and his then wife Diana Spencer. The year was 81, I don't know, early 80s. I'm in Edmonton. And for context, I have to set this up. Fast forward a few years from there, I'm in Lethbridge, and I'm meeting the new district commander of the RCMP for Southern Alberta. He's in charge of everything south of Calgary between Medicine Hat and the Crow's Nest Pass. New guy. So we're having lunch, and I'm telling him this story that I'm about to tell you. So Charles and Diana come to Edmonton for the to officially open, I think it was the World University Games, might have been the Commonwealth Games. We had both in the early 80s in Edmonton. And I'm a reporter, and I had covered a fair bit of royals. I'd done the Queen and Anne and Margaret and whatever. So you get to know how things work in certain contexts. And in Alberta, when royalty comes to town, they always go to Fort Edmonton Park in Edmonton, which is kind of this old historic place. And the Alberta beef producers throw a big steak barbecue, and everybody eats, and it's wonderful. And the rule with royals is always you're not allowed to take pictures when they're eating, because it wouldn't do to have the Queen with a piece of spinach stuck in her teeth, right? So everybody knows that. And the rules in this particular instance for this Charles and Diana visit was no cameras. You could bring electronic equipment if you were a radio guy to get background sound. You're not going to interview the royals. That just doesn't happen. But basically, notepad, pen, and a little tape recorder if you got one. So that was it. So, and you always dressed up for the royals. I always did, 3-piece suit, blue pinstripe, whatever. So we get to the media center, which is downtown Edmonton. They put us all on a bus and haul us out to Fort Edmonton Park, and we get there. And the reporters are kind of milling around. And then the RCMP security detail shows up on another bus, and it's about 20 plainclothes guys. And they get off the bus and they disappear. I don't know how they do it. They just blend into the trees. They're gone, right? And then over time, here comes Charles and Diana on their bus, and they get off and they get escorted onto this little horse-drawn carriage, and they take a nice tour around the park. And, it's wonderful. When they get to where the big tent is set up for the barbecue, they get off, and everybody eats, and it's all good. And the event is ending. And I want to get back to where the bus is parked, because there's a payphone. This is long before cell phones. And I got to file some stuff for, I think it was the 9 o'clock newscast that night. So I'm a little bit ahead of the pack to get out, because it's radio. It's not like I'm the Edmonton Journal and I can write it tonight and it shows up in the paper tomorrow. That was the immediacy of radio I talked about earlier, right? So I want to get to the payphone. So as I'm leaving the group, I suddenly realized that somehow I've ended up on the wrong side of the yellow tape. It happens. I'm trying to steer back to my particular, to get back out of bounds or inbounds, whatever. And there's this voice at my elbow, and it's Charles. Oh, nice evening. And then we're chatting and we're walking toward the horse-drawn carriage, and she's beside him. And we get there and he climbs it, and I help her up into the carriage.
The Queen. Oh, sorry, Diana. Diana.
Diana.
Yeah.
And at this point, I'm telling this to my buddy, the RCMP guy in Southern Alberta, and he interrupts me and he goes, let me guess. He says, you're the idiot that helped Diana up into the carriage. I go, yeah. He says, do you know how many guns were pointed at your head at that point? I go, remember I said I was wearing a blue 3-piece pinstripe suit?
Yeah.
That's what the RCMP plainclothes guys were. And the only thing I was missing was the little earbud. They mistook me, or Charles mistook me for one of the RCMP detail.
No way. Wow.
Yeah, great story.
That's crazy. Wow.
So there's actually, if you really drill down, there's pictures online even today of that visit.
Yeah.
And one of them has Diana climbing up into the carriage, and it's all about Diana, right? Who cares? But there's a hand helping her up. That's my hand.
No way. What year is this?
80, I think 81.
81. Okay, I'll have to give that a Google after. That's hilarious. All right. One thing that came to mind actually when you were telling that story too, I was just thinking, okay, career journalism in the west of Canada. Can you talk a bit about the impact of Ted Byfield? I just read a book a couple months back about his whole life by Jonathan Marin called Prairie Lion, and that was very cool, very insightful. I didn't know tons about him before, but obviously I think he had a major impact on journalism, especially Christians in journalism in Western Canada. So did you ever run into him? Do you have any stories or anything to share?
I ran into him a few times at the Edmonton Press Club. We were both members there.
Oh, yeah.
This was before, I think maybe he'd started Western Report. He hadn't started Alberta Report yet. I was not aware of the impact he was having at that time. By the time he started the whole Triple E Senate thing and what became the Reform Party, I had left the province, so I wasn't really that engaged. I knew his son Link a little bit better than I knew Ted, and I had a lot of respect for Link. That guy had amazing historical perspective, again from a Christian perspective, but really a good resource and a good guy. But I look back on Ted's influence. We wouldn't have a Reform Party today if we hadn't had Ted Byfield, and we don't have a Reform Party today. But to be fair, we probably wouldn't have the Conservative Party as it's constituted today without Ted Byfield, because that was the merger of the old progressive Conservatives and the Reformers. Yep. And he had quite an influence on this young fellow named Stephen Harper back in the day. So there's a lot to be said, I think, for the kind of relentless advocacy work that Ted did in his sphere at that time. Amazing stuff. I interviewed him once for Lighthouse News. That was kind of fun.
Very cool. Well, that's an excellent transition. Let's just get into that. So you start working with ARPA as a contractor. Was it just Lighthouse News, and was there anything else? How did that come about? When did that start? When did that end? There's a bunch of questions. There you go.
I was thinking of starting something on my own.
Yeah.
I had a board. I had everything. It's going to be called News and Worldviews, and it's still in the back of my head as a dream. An aggregator of good Christian commentary and content. There's so much good stuff out there that we tend to compartmentalize. Everybody's in their little silo. The Christian Renewal readers don't read Reformed Perspective, and the RP readers don't read Chuck Colson, and Colson doesn't read World Magazine, and World Magazine doesn't like Albert Mohler or whatever. But there's all these different, pretty solid worldview type enterprises that are out there, and they're all operating in their own little spheres to their own sort of audience. And wouldn't it be neat if we could have some kind of a daily delivery vehicle that says, here's the best of sort of that kind of Christian conservative comment. Doesn't necessarily have to be Reformed. First Things, there's good stuff out there to get people thinking and get people talking, so they're kind of on the same page. So I had this idea that I was going to put that together, and I got as far as appointing a board, and we had some, and then I needed some fundraising to get it going. I had a business plan that would have had it self-sustaining within all 5 years, but that's where it fell apart. I don't know if I'm not a good fundraiser. I don't think that's the problem. I did the fundraising trip in December of I don't know what year it was. And I figured do it at least, 3 or 4 weeks before Christmas. So it was early December because I know people are busy. And there was a certain segment of people in a certain geographic location I'm not going to get into. And I had the commitment from a couple of pastors there who said, yeah, you know what, no problem. We can raise $100 grand just among the farmers and the guys from here. We'll get her done. Just come on out. So I set it up. Well, it was the earliest blizzard they'd ever had in Alberta. I made it, and my pastor friend made it, but all the farmers were snowed in. Nobody could make it. And then I went back to the coast because I had one other potential there. And again, the weather was lousy. It was the next day, and I had one guy who gave me $100 in the whole fundraising trip, and I ended up a month later. I gave it back. I went, no, this is apparently not going to happen. So, thank you very much. And that was it. But during that time, I crossed paths with Mark Peniga and Andre Schutten, and I bounced it off them. Not so much that I wanted their money, but to say, wouldn't it be neat if ARPA was part of this? One of the silos that we pulled into this aggregator. And then sort of as the discussions evolved and it looked like this thing wasn't going to happen, they went, well, what about this? And this became Lighthouse News. And it was a weekly podcast. It was 15 minutes, and it was 15 minutes absolutely dead on. I'm a perfectionist when it comes to that stuff, because part of the dream was to get this onto commercial radio where you have to, time is king. And, there's certain Christian radio stations that might have picked it up if we kept going. And we did, I think a weekly show. We took a bit of a break in the summertime, but did a lot of interesting stuff there. I ran across just yesterday or 2 days ago, it popped up in my memories feed on Facebook. One of the best pieces I think that we did was a sort of a debate interview between the three sort of leading socially conservative candidates for the conservative leadership back when Andrew Scheer won. So it would have been, I guess, 2017. And I had Brad Trost, Pierre Lemieux, and Scheer were on. And so, like I said, it popped up in the memories feed, and I listened to it, and I went, that was actually pretty good stuff. And it was also one of the more shared things that we did on Lighthouse News. It was interesting. I was at the Conservative Leadership Convention in Toronto because my wife and I went to that, and I ran into a guy that a couple of years before we'd gone to church with on the West Coast. He was in the military, was stationed in Esquimalt. He's now stationed in Halifax. So we meet up again in Toronto. Ed, how you doing? I say, who are you supporting? So while I listened to this debate online between these three guys, and this is the one, I go, oh, you mean the debate with Trost and Lemieux and Scheer? He goes, yeah. I said, that was me hosting it. He goes, really? I had no idea. He didn't know what I did, right? We didn't know each other that well, but he was just so impressed. Yeah. It's funny how things loop around. So, yeah.
Huh. Yeah, that's crazy. I was, a fun little tidbit. I was on Scheer's campaign. I was working in Ottawa at that time, so I was also at that convention. So I do remember that. Yeah. That's cool.
I fun still times. Have around the corner. If you were at the convention, they had the signs for all the different regions. Gaspé for Scheer. I stole a Vancouver Island for Scheer one, and it's still sitting in my basement here.
Hey, there you go. That's sweet. Yeah, I got a little those pins that they had, like the drinking milk. I got a little. Yeah. I was saving that.
Yeah, and on the morning of the stuff that was going around was vote. Make sure you're number 2 pick if he's not number 1. Strategically, that was the smartest thing he did. But anyway, that's a whole other issue.
Yeah. Those are fun times. But okay, cool. So you did Lighthouse News. How long did the program run for exactly?
You know what? I'm honestly not real sure. I think we started around 2011 or 12. It wrapped up in 18. When I became mayor, I said, I don't have time for this anymore, because the mayor's role, I had no idea how time consuming that could be. And I mean, it is what you make it, but I took it rather seriously. So I was putting in 60 hours a week as mayor pre-COVID, and I just went, I'm sorry, Mark, but we're done. And so it had, part of me says it had kind of run its course, although we could have kept it going. It had a good support base, it had a good listener base, but they've moved on now to their weekly updates, which is video, which is kind of the flavor du jour on the internet. And we go right back to what I was saying earlier about the 10-ton pencil. I prefer just the audio stuff where I can sit in my jammies and do it. So yeah, it is what it is. But yeah, it ended late. I think summer of 2018, we took the recess, and the election was in September, October. And I said, well, if I get elected, I'm not coming back. So that's kind of where it ended up.
Okay. Yeah, too bad. But all right, that does transition nicely into our next section here. So before you ran for mayor, you were a councillor for, I think, 3 terms, maybe 4. I could be wrong on that. How did you get involved into municipal politics, and what was kind of your entry point there?
I tell people, and it's true, part of it was just being able to give back to community. Anybody who gets into municipal politics in a town of under 100,000 for the money is nuts. I mean, you don't get paid much. That's not what it's about. It's about sort of getting back into and giving back to the community. And part of it for me at that point, it was 2008 when I first ran. And at that point, I'd been covering politics as a journalist for 30 odd years. And there was this arrogant little part of me that said, you know what, now I'm going to get involved and show people how it's done. I mean, because I'd watched, particularly at the local level, because you do a lot of local focus in local radio. I'd watched what worked and what didn't work in terms of governance and those kinds of things. And I went, you know what, I have something to contribute here. So I stepped up, and I got elected in 08 largely on name recognition, because, oh, there's that guy who was on the radio. There's that newspaper columnist. And, everybody went, oh, it's a personality, and they voted for me. And then in 2011, second election, I still won, but I had a lot fewer votes, because once people figured out who I was and what I actually stood for, they weren't quite as enthusiastic in their support. So it was a lesson learned there, but that was okay. I mean, the councillor job, and one of the things you put in the notes here is what was the job like as a councillor. And in my notes, I put it's a lot less interesting than being mayor. And I'm not denigrating the jobs of councillors, but it's an interesting table to be at, particularly where I was, because it was quite a divided group at that time. Vancouver Island is pretty polarized. I mean, you've got your Greens and NDP over here, and you've got your sort of conservative and BC Liberal coalition on the other side. And it's very hard to find middle ground that everybody can agree on the major issues. So if you're in the minority on a council, it gets pretty disheartening, because you keep getting outvoted and you don't feel like you're going to get anything accomplished that you want to get done. And so it can be a bit of a discouraging experience if you're not ready for that. So I guess that's where I would start. And a lot of that depends on the makeup of your council, and it depends on the leadership of your mayor in terms of how he allows issues to come forward and how they're voted on and how they proceed. So there's different ways of doing that, right?
Was that a full-time job for you or a part-time as a councillor?
No, it's the councillor thing. And I said earlier, being mayor is what you make it in terms of how many hours you want to put in. Same is true of council.
Yeah.
But it's definitely in a community that size. It was 30,000 was the population, fairly large geographic area, but in a town that size, it's not a full-time job, and it's not paid as a full-time job. I think I was making $1,500 a month when I started, which whatever. But I got into it for the right reasons. I'm quite satisfied with that. I'm quite satisfied with what I did accomplish there. There were certain files that I sort of jumped on early in the piece. One of the things people don't realize is how slowly things move in government in terms of getting policy changed, and whether that's at the local government. And a lot of what you do municipally has to do with senior governments. right? In terms of trying to get them to change policy because that policy negatively impacts your municipality or your regional district or your county or whatever you're in. And, so we spent a lot of time working with provincial governments of various stripes. The Liberals were in when I started and the NDP's in now. And a lot of that's about, building relationships and doing that sort of stuff. So a lot of good lessons. A lot of good lessons learned there about those relationships, which we can get into later.
No, yeah, that's a good point about relationships. I noticed you had a post on Facebook talking about your I don't know if friendship is the right term, but your relationship with John Horgan and getting to know him a bit over the years. And obviously he was the former NDP premier. How do you go about building relationships with people who share different political opinions? Because that's something that's pretty rare nowadays.
Well, you approach them as people.
Mm-hmm.
You approach them as people. All right. Selena Robinson is, and she's going to hate it if she ever watches this, but whatever. She's the former municipal affairs minister. I got to know her when she was a municipal affairs critic when Gordon Campbell was still the premier. And she was the critic, and then she became the Minister of Municipal Affairs, the Minister of Housing, and then she moved to finance, and she's in advanced education now. She's done all kinds of different stuff. She's kind of a jack of all trades cabinet minister. But Selena and I have had a very good working relationship on a number of files. It's if I needed something, like to this day, she's in my cell phone, and if I and I'm in Alberta now, so why would I? But if I need something, I can call somebody. I don't know if you remember, about a year ago, well, a year and a half ago, we had a huge weather event in BC that flooded out a whole bunch of highways and half of the Fraser Valley, and the Coquihalla was shut down for 8 months. Bridges were washed out. It was just a disaster. And the morning after that weather event, I'm on the computer, and I'm still an early riser, just getting up at 3:30 in the morning for radio. The body clock doesn't reset, sadly. So I'm I'm looking at some of the pictures of the devastation from the flood. And I picked up my phone, and it was 6 a.m. and I send Selena a text, and I go, Madam Finance Minister, how you doing this morning? Like, I just can't imagine being in that. Yesterday was a multi-billion-dollar day. Right.
Yeah.
And she responded. And that to me is how you build relationships. You don't get into policy differences right off the top, because that's just, you approach each other as people.
Yeah.
And that translates into some interesting policy discussions. I recall, I don't know, about 6 months before I retired as mayor, in BC, they have this thing called the speculation and vacancy tax, which is tacked onto your property taxes in some areas. The idea being that there's far too many people from Ontario or Alberta that have a vacation home in BC that sits empty for 9.5 months of the year, and you only use it in the summertime. So the government says if it's not occupied at least 8 months of the year, we're going to tax you extra, because what we want to do is encourage you to put this thing on the rental market. Okay, it's one way of looking at it. And the jurisdictions that were neighboring us in the Cowichan Valley, so Victoria at the south and Nanaimo in the north, both had a spec and vacancy tax imposed. And we did some analysis, and we went, our prices are rising more quickly than theirs, and our rental vacancy rate is lower than theirs. And my council said, you know what, we should write the Minister of Finance and tell her we want the spec tax here, because it's obviously working in those other communities. I'm not convinced that that's why things were what they were. The Cowichan Valley, to me, was an undiscovered real estate gold mine, and the prices were going to go up irrespective of whether we had the tax. But okay, council sets a directive. Council instructs the mayor to write the Minister of Finance to request this spec tax in the Cowichan Valley. So okay, I write the letter, sign it. About 4 months go by, didn't hear anything back. Then one day my phone rings, and it's the finance minister. And she goes, I got this letter from you about the spec tax, and we're looking at it for the next budget. Are you still on board with this? And I said, Selena, come on, you know me. I said, I'm a conservative. I don't believe taxes solve anything. But my counsel says you should do this. And on something like this, I operate on the direction of counsel. So, yeah, we're still on board. Right. But I mean, those are the kind of policy. And she laughed because she goes, yeah, I was kind of surprised to get this letter from you. I said, well, council sets the direction. That's how it works, whether you like it or not. So, and I didn't like it, but I wrote the letter because they told me to. So that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go. So that's a great example of relationship building right there. Okay, sweet. So yeah, that was from your time as mayor, obviously. Transitioning from being a counselor to being a mayor. Sounds like you had a lot more fun being a mayor. What was that process like running for mayor? Did you face a lot more scrutiny? You probably obviously had to run across the whole community, so that required a bit more of a campaign effort. Maybe take the listeners through that a little bit.
Well, actually, just to set it clear, we don't have a ward system in BC. So even if you run for council, you run across the entire community. But it was 2018. I had done 3 terms as councillor, and I was actually going to retire. I was done then. I figured, you know what, I've done my shtick. And one of the early influences in my elected political life municipally, I went to see a guy who I sort of replaced in 08. Not that you replace anybody technically, because it's not that kind of electoral system, but he was a pretty conservative guy on council, and he'd been there for 20 some years. He was a lawyer, and he was going to become the head of the Law Society of BC. His term was coming up, so he didn't think he'd have time. So in 08, he decided not to run again, and I got one of the vacant slots that was left, and that was one of his vacancies. So a couple days after the election, I called him up. I said, Glenn, let's go for a bowl of soup. I need some advice. And we got talking. I said, what's the number one piece of advice you would give me? He said, don't make the same mistake I did. He said, don't stick around too long. You get way too entrenched in your ideas. You know every file inside out. You have no desire to look at things with fresh eyes. Maybe there's a different perspective. Allow room for other people. Even if you just take 4 years off and then come back, but give it a break. Like don't stick around too long. So 2018, I'm kind of going, that's 10 years is probably enough. And I was seriously pondering retirement at that point. And then the incumbent mayor said, I'm not going to run again, which is fair enough. And then somebody stepped up who I really thought would be not good for the job. I thought she would be a problem. So a bunch of people came to me and said, Al, we can't let this happen because the incumbent's not running again. And she was sort of on the conservative side of the spectrum, but really didn't understand governance. And I'll just leave it there. Sure. So I figured, okay, I'll take one for the team and, run. So July 1st of 2018, July 2nd, I made my declaration and, had an event and, how you do that stuff. And I emailed the incumbent mayor the night before, just as a courtesy, let him know. So, John, I'm running for mayor. Okay. The next day I run into him at an event with his wife. And I said, did you get my email? And she looked at me and she goes, yeah, we got your email, Al. You know what? If he changes his mind and decides to run, I'm going to vote for you because he's got to retire. Guess that's done. Well, fast forward now to September when it's the deadline for the declarations. He changed his mind and he stepped back in the race. If I had known he was going to run, he and I didn't agree on everything, but he wasn't a bad mayor. He was right. I wouldn't even have run. But at this point, I've raised $20,000 for the campaign. I can't back out. Way you go. Right now, we're into campaign mode for September and half of October. And I spent most of my time, not on him, but on this other person in the conservative sort of side, because that vote was going to get split. There was 8,400 votes cast, and I won by 10 votes.
No way. Wow.
So They called me Landslide Al for a certain portion of the term. It was interesting. Yeah.
Wow. That's incredible. Okay. What do you think was, obviously you went through the period of COVID, that's obviously a challenging time to be a mayor, no doubt, and not something you would have anticipated coming in. What would you say during your four-year term would be your biggest success and also your biggest failure?
COVID, and I guess that's an answer to both of your questions. I mean,
Yeah.
people really have no, and I'm not looking for sympathy, but people have no idea of what you're up against in the local government context with something like that. Particularly at the start, we didn't know what we didn't know. And we knew that we didn't know what we didn't know, but we didn't know. We were getting images from Italy of, the morgues were being overrun. What do you do, right? The most difficult, that's the wrong word, the most unforgettable moment of my time as mayor was in, I'm thinking, April of 2019. March 18th, 20th was when they declared the pandemic. So it's a little bit after that. And staff, we're having our weekly senior staff meeting, and sometimes the mayor shows up. Sometimes he's invited, sometimes he's not. I invited myself that time, I think. And the question that was being bandied about the table was, what do we do with our ice rinks? Because normally it's April, we shut them down, right? Hockey season winding down. What do we do when hockey's over and curling is done? And the debate was about, and they asked me, Mr. Mayor, what do you think? Should we keep the chillers going because we may need these arenas for morgues? That's not the kind of thing you think you're signing up for when you run for mayor, right? At the end of the day, we kicked it around for a while. We said, well, we can get them back down to the required morgue-like temperature in about 70 hours. So shut down the chillers and we'll flash them up again if we have to. But and I know in retrospect, I'm sure people listening to this podcast go, the whole thing was a hoax and the government this and the government that. When you don't know what you don't know and you're in the middle of it, you gotta cut the electeds a little slack because they're doing the best they can with what they know.
Yeah.
And I didn't see that, and I don't see that today. I see so much vitriol and I see so much anger directed at people we don't agree with just because we don't agree with them, and they automatically become, the Antichrist. They become evil. And I know that, and I appreciate there was government overreach on a bunch of levels. I mean, I never thought I'd see the day, particularly in Alberta, where we're throwing pastors in jail.
Yep.
And I understand I was weaned on the sphere sovereignty piece, right? You got the state, you got the church, you got the family, and never the twain shall overlap. But we live in a society, for better or worse, and we can have the discussion about whether this is the way it should be, but we live in a society where the government is responsible for public health. So how does that play out? I mean, one of the realities of COVID in the BC context that you discover when you're kind of on the inside a little bit, because I did whatever I could with John Horgan, the premier, and some of the other people. We'd have weekly meetings with senior cabinet ministers, and I kept bringing up the church piece and going, how is it I can go to the pub and I can't go to church? I mean, it's not consistent. Fix it.
Yeah.
But one of the things that is not widely known in the general public is what started the church, the religious, let me be more broad, the religious assembly restrictions in BC during COVID was a situation in Surrey where we have the largest Sikh diaspora outside of India, right? We've got all kinds of gurdwaras and Sikh temples and stuff there. And these people, part of their culture and their religion is all about food. And I mean, it's wonderful. I don't know if you ever attended their events, but man, they feed you and they're all about the hospitality.
Yep.
Well, they kept doing that during COVID, and they had some super spreader events within their community. Okay, now you're the premier. Do you say, all right, Sikhs, no more of your stuff, but you Jews and you Muslims and you Christians can keep going? How do you navigate that when you're Bonnie Henry or you're the premier? You go, no, you know what? This was a religion. Let's just, in the interest of safety, shut down these religious gatherings until we figure it out. I'm not defending. I'm saying that's how some of these decisions are arrived at. So COVID was a no-win for anybody in political leadership, except Justin Trudeau, because he managed to exploit every division there was to his advantage, and I find that abhorrent. But Jason Kenney lost his job. There were a whack ton of mayors in BC that were not reelected in October. I might have been one of them if I had decided to rerun. I don't know. I mean, we'll never know because I voluntarily walked away. But it was a very difficult time to be in local government. Another example, again, early days, Italian morgues filling up, all this stuff. We're on Vancouver Island. Geographically, it's the ideal place to say, you know what, we don't want COVID here. I spearheaded a group of, I think, about 45 mayors and a bunch of regional district chairs and whoever else we could get from local government, including First Nations chiefs and stuff, all up and down the island, pretty much everybody on board, saying, you know what, BC Ferries from now on is essential traffic only. We want our food delivered, we want our gas delivered. That's it. Everybody else, get out of here until we get this COVID thing sorted out. Maybe we can keep this off the island. Well, it didn't get anywhere. Horgan kind of looked at it and went, no, we're not going to do that, which, okay. In retrospect, it was probably the right decision because we now know that it probably wouldn't have made any difference. If you're the mayor of Prince Rupert at that time, Rupert, if you know the geography, has one road in and out. They're a coastal community west of Prince George, and there's only one road in and out. And they decided, Rupert, the city, their regional district, and all their pertinent First Nations, they said, we're going to close the highway. We're going to declare a state of local emergency, shut down the highway with the same kind of mentality. We're going to keep COVID out. So they declared a state of emergency. It took Mike Farnworth, the Attorney General, Solicitor General at the time, about 40 hours to override that local state of emergency. I said, no, that's not on because we don't want to patchwork all over BC. So again, you do the best you can with what you got in the position you're in. And as a municipal politician, you are a child of the province, and they ultimately say yes or no. So,
yeah. There's only so much you could do, eh? Yeah, and I do think people do appreciate if they step back and think, like in the early days, there's so much you don't know, and the decisions that had to be made at that time. I think what really grated on a lot of people's nerves, of course, was how long it went on, and the things we did know, but the government wouldn't admit to, and the extended overreach. But yeah, you spoke to that. That's I know you see that as well. Okay, so that was your time as mayor. Anything else you want to get to before we get to the last chapter, which is your consulting firm now?
No, one of the things you put in the notes here was advice for people looking to get into politics. We talked about the journalism thing and why I don't recommend it. And I should qualify that a little bit and say, you know what, there's a lot of good independent journalism out there that's starting up now. First Reading and some of these other sort of subscription only things. And they're not unbiased, but they're trying. And we're in the middle of a huge transition on what journalism looks like in North America. And I don't know where that's going. And until we figure that out, I'm not sure that I'd recommend getting into it. But you know what? Maybe get in on the ground floor because it's not a bad idea. I just go in with your eyes open, I guess is it. But as far as politics, advice for people getting into that, I guess two things. I did this before I ran in 2008. Get involved in your community as a citizen, as a Christian citizen, but as a citizen. And again, we don't wear our Christianity on our sleeve, but we don't apologize for it. Once people figure out that your Christian worldview doesn't mean you got a horn going out of the back of your head or that it disqualifies you because you hold all kinds of radical views, it makes the path a little easier. For me, it was, I got involved in my local minor hockey team, not as a coach or anything, but a lot of the front office stuff, and I did the announcing at the games and the stats, and just because I like teenagers and it was a good hockey program, so I got involved in that. And there was an old war memorial outside of my community, way up on a mountain, that was built originally after the First World War and then rebuilt after World War II, that used to be maintained by the Legion. It was this beacon of white. It was a big pillar about 60 feet high. And when I moved back to the coast in 2000, I stumbled upon this thing. I was on a hike one day and I'd forgotten it was there because you couldn't see it from the base of the mountain anymore because it was gray. All the paint had come off. So I get back down to the bottom. I called the Legion. I go, what's with the old cairn on Mount Brevoort? How come it's in such disrepair? Well, we have a bank account for that, and we used to go up there every couple of summers with a case of beer and a bucket of whitewash, and we'd clean it up. But our guys are too old; we just can't do it anymore. Would you like to take it on? Sure, why not? She calls me about 4 days later and says, that bank account I was telling you about for maintenance? I said, yeah. She said, well, the two guys with signing authority are both dead. So I don't know how we're going to get you the money. So I fundraised and we put it together. And to this day, the thing, because we didn't whitewash it, we actually used real paint and did a pretty bang up job. So it's now 24 years later and you can still see that thing pretty good. So I got known for that kind of community involvement stuff. And so that makes the electoral path easier. And the second part, and this is something I learned from Joseph Benami, and I don't know if you know Joseph, he managed Brad Trost's campaign, I think, in the leadership, I think it was Trost, Jewish guy from Toronto, very active in his community, Orthodox Jew. But I heard him speak at an event one time, and he said, the biggest mistake we Jews made is we ghettoized. We just hung out with ourselves. He said, don't do that. Get out into the community where God has placed you and get involved, and don't be this insulated little cloister thing. Don't do that. Be the salt. It's good stuff.
Yeah. No, that's good advice. Yeah, definitely. For anybody looking to get into municipal politics, there is Siebring Consulting to help you along the way. How about that for a little transition? So tell me about that, because you're semi-retired maybe, but you still have this consulting going on. So what's that kind of work involved?
I don't give campaign advice. It's not a political thing. It's a governance piece.
Yeah.
The reality is that in I don't know about the rest of Canada, but I know here in Alberta and in BC, every 4 years we have a municipal election, and about 40 to 45% of the people at the table change, either because of retirements or electoral defeat. And that's councillors and mayors or reeves or regional district chairs or whatever you have it. And so you get 40% of the electeds are newly elected. They've just come through a campaign where they've promised to change the world, and they haven't got a clue how to do it. Plus, half the stuff they've promised to change is outside their jurisdiction. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I see, somebody running for municipal council going, we need to fix these environmental regulations because it's taken way too long to get anything built around here. Well, that's nice. You want to do that? Get your butt elected to the provincial legislature, because that's where they write the environmental regulations, which the municipality has to enforce, but we have no control over.
Yeah.
So that's part of what I do, is explain spheres, explain that, you're a creature of the province. There's only so much you can accomplish in this area. And I've done a fair bit of work on codes of conduct. That's the flavor of the day these days, because we've had a lot of bad behavior at municipal tables in BC in particular. There was one jurisdiction where literally the elected officials were throwing furniture at each other in closed meetings. Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, got that
violent.
And and staff didn't feel safe, and we hear that, I don't feel safe. No. One staff member I know personally, after a meeting, he went, I'm not going out the front door, I'm going down the back door, and two councillors chased him down the stairs. They wanted to take him out the parking lot. I mean, it was that intense. It was just the same municipality. So at that point, the province stepped in, because it wasn't just one. It was becoming endemic, and it's indicative of the divisions that how polarized we've become in our political discourse. So the province said, what, from now on, every municipality and regional district in BC has to consider having a code of conduct. You don't have to have one. You can decide not to have one, but if you don't, you have to issue a public statement. Why not? And if you're a small municipality, I recommend against the code, because if you ever have a complaint filed and you need an investigation, it's a $40,000 touch. And if you're the village of Zabalos, you can't afford that, right? So sometimes it's okay not to have a code, but you have to consider it. So I've
Yeah.
been doing some consulting on those things, and I've helped to write 4 different codes now. And I mean, they're all to some degree cut and paste because they all contain the same fundamentals. But one municipality came to me and said, one of the biggest credibility problems local politicians have, and I don't know if you run into it in Ontario, but we've seen it a fair bit out here, is when a mayor or a councillor is charged with a criminal code offense, there's nothing that can be done to remove them from office until the thing clears the court, because they're innocent until proven guilty. And that really gives the local politicians a bad name, even if the guy's innocent. I mean, come on, build a process. So we built a process, and then I looked. The government had just rewritten the Community Charter, which is the Local Government Act in BC, to also address this, to say if you're charged under the Criminal Code or the Controlled Substances Act with an indictable offense, you are automatically suspended from your elected office with pay until the thing clears the court. So we wrote that into the code just to provide the transparency for folks. So there's all kinds of interesting spins that you get. Different municipalities are worried about different things, and they want different things addressed in their code. So it's mostly about helping local governments. I'm also a member of the National Association of Parliamentarians. That's the Robert's Rules process geeks. I love doing that. I provide advice to nonprofits and church boards, whatever. If you're having trouble facilitating orderly meetings, I help you with that. I show you how to do that stuff, and hopefully navigate it through in a way that, while it doesn't make everybody happy, will prevent people from getting too unhappy, I guess, is the way to do it, because you try to provide an even-handed approach. I was at a meeting recently, and I won't say which organization, but we just moved to Alberta and we're starting to get involved in different things. And the chair called the meeting to order, and I was like, okay, we have the agenda before us. I need a motion to approve the agenda. Somebody moves it, somebody seconds it. Okay, I need a motion to adopt the minutes of the last meeting. Somebody moves it, okay, at the end of the meeting, I walked up to her and I said, you realize that just because a motion is moved and seconded doesn't mean that you move on. You actually have to call a vote. She had no idea. She had no idea. And she's chairing this, right? So, I mean, fundamentals, folks, it ain't that hard, but some people don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So good man to know for anybody who's looking to get into office or is in office and needs a little bit of help. I think my final question, just looking over your whole life and in the positions you've been in, is on the question of leadership. So what do you think makes a good leader? Especially when it comes to something like politics. How do you galvanize people? How do you inspire people and bring people together as a leader in a position like a mayor?
See, and you asked me earlier about what I consider my failures as mayor. And maybe it's just that I'm insecure, but I'm not sure I'm the right guy to ask or answer that question, because I'm not sure I provided the leadership that certainly I was happy with. And again, it was COVID, so that's my excuse. But to me, I guess what I always tried to do was be fair and listen to all sides, even when I disagree with them. And beyond that, and I'll give you an example again from my time as mayor. When I got elected in 2018 as mayor, every major issue that came to our table was decided on a 5-2 vote. And the mayor and one councillor were the 2, and the other 5 were on the other end of the spectrum. And it was, we had people there who were very green in their ideology and NDP and whatever. And fair enough, they got elected. They're there. They have a job to do. But over, excuse me, over the 4 years, by the end of year 2, those votes had started to swing. It wasn't 5-2 consistently. It sometimes was 4-3, with the mayor and 3 councillors on one side and 3 other councillors on the other side. And that was, and I'm not trying to take credit for it or anything like that, but that was a case of mentoring these councillors and saying, look, you have to understand that when you're elected to office, you are there to represent more than just the subset of people who put you in office. You are there to represent the community, more broadly speaking, right? And that leads to some really interesting, mind-blowing paradigms for the folks on the left, if I can put it that way. We had a case, and it kind of illustrates the point I'm trying to make about leadership and about governance. We had a situation where we had a piece of land in our municipality that had been zoned for a modular home / mobile home park, trailer park, call it what you want, for about 25 years. It was next to the highway, but it was not close to any major urban installations. We had 4 communities within our municipality. That's how it was set up. It wasn't close to anything. It wasn't close for transit. It wasn't walkable or any of that stuff. I've always, and again, this goes back to the how do you apply your Christian principles in politics. I've always believed in the sort of supremacy of property rights. If I have a piece of property, there's certain things I should be able to do with it to advance it and make it better. That kind of runs smack dab into a lot of the best practices in urban planning now, which says if your property isn't located within the municipal service area, we don't allow a bunch of work on it because it costs us too much money to run the water and sewer and infrastructure out there, right? So smart growth is what it's called. And my municipality is very much about smart growth. So anyway, this piece of property had been zoned for this for 20 odd years. And it had just been sold, but the new owner said, you know what, I want to get this done. I'm going to build a mobile home park. In our context in North Cowichan, one of the things that we did was that every Monday, council would get an email from staff going, here's the issues you should be aware of, even though most of these issues will never come to the council table. I mean, we have policy, staff, carries out the policy, and we never see it. But if there's a major development coming, even if it's within policy, council should know, so that if a citizen comes up and say, hey, I see these bulldozers on this piece of property, what's going in there? We know and we can tell them. So that was the premise of this Monday newsletter. So this Monday newsletter comes out, and yeah, this piece of property is going to be developed for a mobile home park. And one of the councilors got rather agitated about this and said, no, it's outside the urban containment boundary. It counters every principle of smart growth. It's urban sprawl. It's all the things we don't want. How can we stop this? Well, you can't. It's zoned. He has development rights to do it. Well, he dug around and figured out that yes, council could downzone the property to disallow that development. Unilaterally, we can do that as long as the developer has not spent substantial money in furtherance of his existing zoning. So, he hadn't poured the pads for the mobile homes or whatever, which he hadn't done. Yeah. So this council puts forward a motion to downzone. Now we get to the council debate, and I was expecting the usual 5-2 vote. The 5 greenies, and I'm not being pejorative, but the folks on that side against myself, one other council. One of the people on the other side of the spectrum cracks her mic and says, Mr. Mayor, I'm really conflicted on this. I completely understand where this motion is coming from. I'm against urban sprawl. This is bad urban planning. This is everything we don't want. But we're in a housing crisis. I'm the only councillor at this table that's renting. And I don't know where I'm going to move in 6 months because I think my landlord wants to sell my place. We are in a housing crisis. We need these 120 units. And she voted against the downside and took one of the other councillors with her. All of a sudden, we had a 4-3 vote the other way. And a lot of that was, and not that I take credit, but I always tried, as a journalist too, when I had kids coming up out of J school that we were training, to try to talk about reality, right? This is how the world works. It's not all about, fairy dust and unicorn farts. I mean, there are actual economic realities that have to be considered and addressed and worked with. And for the rest of the term, and not on all the issues, but on some of the big issues, it was 4-3 votes. So was that leadership? I don't know. But I mean, that I took the time that I had at the governance table and the experience I'd had in journalism, and I try to work with the the younger folks to mentor and say, you've got to take the bigger community perspective on these issues. You can't just govern for your subset. So I guess that's leadership.
Yeah.
And sometimes that goes the other way. Okay. Sometimes I didn't vote the way I was expected to because I took the broader and I went, no, you know what? This aligns with my philosophy, but it would be a stupid thing to do. So we're not doing it.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Being open-minded, being fair, taking the time to talk to others on the other side and building those relationships like you talked about. So that's all very valuable. Well, I think we're reaching the end here, Al. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us and to tell us all about your career and the lessons learned. Yeah, much appreciated, and yeah, all the best.
Thanks, Lucas.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you want to send us your feedback, and we'd love to hear it, please email us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. If you want to find us online or social media, we got a lot of great content there. Just search Reformed Real Talk and we should come right up. This show is created and produced by myself, Lucas Holtfluer, and Tyler Vanderwood, and our wonderful podcast manager who does all the editing is Mariah Tamiga. So we're really thankful for her contribution to the show as well. That's all for now, folks. Thanks for watching or listening, and we'll catch you next time.